Hey everybody, this is Josh, and this is my Indigenous Leadership Theory and Practice presentation. I wanted to focus on obviously my discipline of education, um, and in particular, I thought about two levels, so the teacher leader certification and then teacher leaders and PD training. So I'm attempting to apply what we've learned through various readings and discussions over the course of the term into these two specific contexts. So just to kind of lay out what I'm thinking a little bit more clearly for you, I look at teacher leadership in and of itself as, or teachers as leaders. I think is an important thing to consider. They are the models for students as they're coming up. What they look like, what language they speak, what values they carry. All of that greatly impacts students who we want to become our next leaders. And so that's one end of this, if you will. And the other is the sort of administrator route. So leaders at a school and how they think about developing teachers and therefore improving teaching and learning, particularly in an Indigenous context, so that it ultimately impacts teaching and learning for students. And then, sort of at the base of all of this, is a sense of inherent sovereignty that I think you'll find as a thread throughout my discussion of both the teacher leader route and the administrator route. In that, in order for these two ideas to be enacted, and hopefully I'll come back to this at the end to sort of wrap it up. Inherent sovereignty has to be demonstrated and utilized, and so I think to the ideas that many of the authors and the videos that we've watched about how to practice that, and how to make sure that um, inherent sovereignty is being used in an education setting. So for a teacher leader route, the outcomes that I would like to see in terms of my theory and practice is certification of teachers that a tribe deems indispensable to teaching culture, language, and ways of life. And I don't think that happens. Well, that happens in one respect right now, and that's in terms of the 504 license that allows a tribe to certify a language teacher. But there are many other instances, in my experience working with schools that serve Native children, of finding powerful local leaders, either in a tribal context or in an urban context, and wanting them to be the teacher leaders at a school, but having official, state or district impediments to that, like licensure, school testing, that aren't necessarily a part of the content expertise of the person that we want to get in these schools for our students, or for Indigenous students, tribal students. So that's the first piece, and then the other is recruitment of teacher leaders to design curriculum for a tribe students that centers on local knowledge, skills, and epistemologies. So I think these two things go hand in hand. And on the one hand, we need to recruit the teachers who have this expertise. And then on the other hand, we need to make sure that there aren't barriers to certify them, therefore get them paid, therefore interact with students as a regular ed teacher might. In terms of the administrator route, I'm thinking about the way that professional development is set up. So, traditionally speaking, you see, or traditionally in a Western way, you're seeing data that drives professional development. You're seeing special education that drives professional development, so on and so forth. But what you don't see, especially in schools dedicated to culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally based um, um, pedagogy, and therefore curriculum and instruction, you don't see professional development with that same emphasis. Maybe there's a time to talk about what cultural relevance is, but there a time that actually is culturally relevant during professional development, and not as a one-off, but as something that happens regularly. So my proposal here is for leaders of schools to plan professional development that's based on community-driven outcomes, community-driven evaluations of teachers, and community-driven scope and sequence for learning for teachers and staff that focuses on culturally relevant practice. The first one is the teacher leader route. I'll go through that one and the various questions that were asked by Dr. Minthorn. So leadership exists at various levels, as I noted, including teacher leaders versed in culturally relevant language-focused content. So teacher leadership isn't identified only through I have my certification with the state of New Mexico and therefore I'm allowed to teach. But that's how the state treats it at this point. So often these leaders are not official, I should say, due to local, state, and federal requirements. So that's the big problem that I've found in my work, and that I continue to find as I travel to schools. So the community in this initiative would be the local indigenous community or tribe. So in a tribally specific context, this would mean the tribe itself, for example, the Navajo Nation, the Pueblo of Santa Clara, something like that. I think there's also an interesting consideration here for how this would work in an urban setting, for example, at the Native American Community Academy. So I'll leave up to you all to consider as well. The school community itself, so teachers and staff, and then the student body community, so the students who will actually feel the impact of having teachers who look like them and who come from the places they do and speak the language they do as the ultimate sort of result of such a movement. So here's my theory, and I stole this a little bit from a teacher that I work with at NACA, whose enduring understanding for the year is we have everything we need to heal ourselves. So I stole a bit of this in terms of indigenous communities have everything they need to heal and thrive, meaning that there's this conception that has been carried out since the boarding schools and before of needing to impart certain ways of life on indigenous peoples is long overdue to be overturned. So thinking about this idea of inherent sovereignty that exists within tribes and focuses on the people in the tribe with the cultural expertise that can be taught to students, with the language expertise, with the community expertise, with the land and environmental and sustainable expertise. Something that I see on a daily basis as I travel to various communities, and really getting rid of the barriers that exist for implementing these by allowing tribes the inherent sovereignty, exercising the inherent sovereignty to accredit teachers who carry this sort of knowledge, and thereby give them the autonomy to create the cultural learning that only they have. They are the experts. There is internal expertise. So what or who has helped me to build this theory? I started with the idea of tribal crit by McKinley and Brayboy, and the idea that there is institutional racism. It is very present in the issue that I'm raising right now, in that there are barriers for Native people with tribal expertise or indigenous expertise in general to come in and share that with children because of the barriers that are set up by Western systems and racist institutional systems. There are proven academic benefits when students share demographic traits with teachers. So students need to be able to look to teachers and see themselves represented linguistically, culturally, racially, ethnically, and this is supported by all kinds of data, including an article I read called Representation in the Classroom. Leadership is about culture and story, and this is ignored in official Western constructs of education. So an initiative like this challenges the Western idea of leadership, and I referred specifically to Archuleta's Approaching Leadership Through Culture, Story, and Relationships, which we read in Module 1 for this. Indigenous values are central to tribes' prosperity and the rhetoric of decolonization. So thinking back to Module 2, LaDonna Harris, and her noting that the underlying ideas behind Indigenous leadership and Indigenous communities are Indigenous core values, and her speaking specifically of her Comanche core values. So this idea being, that in the classroom, there are people who embody Indigenous core values or tribally specific core values and should be in the classroom with students who need to carry those on and acquire those in order to be a successful person. And the last one is there is perhaps no more important role sorry about that, in a nation seizing its future than that of educator, according to Cornell Purity. The turnaround for many nations starts with the teaching of a new story about itself, a story of capable self-rule. So the idea that this inherent sovereignty is being practiced by educators for the betterment of the tribe or community itself. Sorry, the last one is Indigenous children need Indigenous leaders in front of them in classrooms. And this is something that I just pulled from my own work at the Naka Inspired Schools Network, where I've had the opportunity to observe in classrooms where the demographic of the teachers meets the demographic of the students, and how valuable that is in terms of relationship building and long-term success in school and the things that come after school. So the question of is it applicable to this specific community now? A couple of things I noted earlier is that there is a 504 license. So, this is a relatively new idea that tribes can certify their own language teachers in their own way. Laguna's process is different than the Dene Nation in terms of how you get a 504, but it's up to the tribe. And then you go teach in a regular public school. There are tribes taking over BIE schools, the tribally controlled grant schools, and this is contributing to the idea of diversifying what it means to be a teacher and who's quote unquote certified or should be certified to be in the classroom. And then the last part is what is the next exercise of sovereignty around certifying the tribe's culture language experts to work and get paid for working as the teachers of the tribe's children. So just a question that I think I would ask to leaders in Indigenous communities, at what point do tribes certify not just teachers, but certify schools? At what point are tribes authorizers of charter schools rather than just BIE schools, BIE grant schools? So, what are the mechanisms of power that exist within inherent sovereignty to allow for this practice to take place? So the other route here is the school leader route. And in so I'm thinking about culturally relevant professional development. So again, if you go into most professional developments for public school X, you'll see PD on numeracy, literacy, data, classroom management, discipline, special education. I'm sure that many of you can add to that list. But the question is, how are schools and community leaders, educators, and teachers required to be bicultural in respects to adapting to the culture of their students and communities? So we usually think about the term bicultural in terms of students adapting to the culture of the school, but many have argued that it in fact goes the other way, and that teachers have a responsibility to understand the culture of students and to be amenable to changing their ways based upon that. So what does professional development look like to do that? So this is the graphic that goes along with Naka PD. You can see that there's a Dene word in the center there that refers to relationships in many different aspects. And then there's the SNBH process, which I won't butcher on a videotape in front of you all. But basically, it's a process of continuous improvement that starts with visioning, planning, reflection, before reflection, a process of doing, so implementing a plan, and then reflection at the end. So this is the sort of the idea being that Naka is a school that serves Indigenous students and communities, and therefore uses a framework that is built in an Indigenous community to guide its professional development. So that's one way of thinking about it. So the idea of who is your community in this, I think the community are the school and district leaders on reservations, border towns, and in urban contexts that serve Indigenous children. Ultimately, that though comes down to the community of teachers of Indigenous children and Indigenous children themselves. So the question would be, how does an Indigenous child benefit when their teacher is given professional development that is rooted in culture, that is rooted in culturally relevant teaching and learning, and not just, again, not just definitions, but an actual experience with culturally relevant teaching and learning. So my theory here is that culturally relevant teaching and learning cannot exist without culturally relevant experiential professional development for teachers. So what does that mean? This is what regular professional development looks like. You have somebody standing at the front talking about any number of ideas that need to be improved in the school. Like I said, literacy, numeracy, data. But what about when professional development looks like this, where you can see that there are culturally relevant activities going on, there's smudging going on, there's language being said. At this particular professional development, there was language learning happening and learning about land-based experiential education for students. So that's not to say that there's a hierarchy here, that one is better than the other, but in contemporary schools, why are we not balancing? Why are leaders not balancing, this sort of professional development with professional development on this end that's encouraging teachers to push harder into culturally relevant teaching and learning? So, who or what has helped build this theory? There's the idea of transformational learning that is present in professional development communities. Basically, this means that teachers require examination and inquiry into really understanding what a concept is that they're applying. And so in this case, if all we're doing is talking about culturally relevant teaching and learning, but we're not having teachers experience it, then we're not going to find the transformation that we're looking for. There's structured PD focused on cultural responsiveness. So this idea that it can't be a one-off, that it needs to be structured, it needs to be rhythmed, it needs to be on the regular in order for this practice to take hold in a school is essential. And then the ideas, so these are some ideas from class. Indigenous leadership is about indigenous ways of knowing, and Pigeon presents us with the 4 R's of respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and responsibility. So teaching teachers how to ground themselves in indigenous ways of knowing, rather than assuming that their job is to simply teach math to indigenous students in Navajo, New Mexico, and not to root themselves in the epistemologies of the community they're serving. The idea of revolutionary leadership, which is context-driven, this idea that in a school that is dedicated to Indigenous education in a modern context, a leader or teacher leader or administrator has to be context-driven. They have to be community-driven. They have to be willing to adjust based upon the need. They don't come in as static leaders. The idea of developing Indigenous leaders means seeing Indigenous concepts of leadership in the classroom and school. So this comes from Gran et al. And the idea of that comparative analysis that we read. And so thinking about, Indigenous concepts of leadership as practiced by teachers, by administrators in schools, and as criteria for developing students, so that they don't meet the outside expectations of leadership in a Western context, but they meet the idea of leadership within a community context. And just one thought here is that Anaka's mission, in part, has the big idea of strong leaders in it. So we want our students to become strong leaders. Well, are we defining that based upon Western norms of leadership, or are we defining that based upon Indigenous concepts of leadership? And the last one is learning from historical models of Indigenous knowledge and leadership. This fits well with the idea that I just spoke about, but using how tribes are organized and how leadership operates within tribes as a basis for how professional development could look, how teacher leaders look, and how administrators at schools look. So is it applicable to this specific community now, and how would you present it as a theory? So this work is sort of ongoing in my everyday work. So NIS in schools and culturally relevant art and culturally based professional development design. I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of how this might look. So at Six Directions Indigenous School in Gallup, there's the idea of planning professional development around core values that are indigenously grounded in particular in Zuni core values and in Dene core values that the majority of which that school serves. And then so that's one area of thinking about how professional development might work. And unfortunately, I got the wrong order here, so I'm going to have to exit out of this, and I'll just pull this around. Here's an essential question that guides learning at Dream Dene, which is in Shiprock, New Mexico. How can we, this is a question that guides PD, how can we increase student Navajo language comprehension through the use of questioning? And then some enduring understandings that focus on the need for staff to study what it means to learn language, how to understand the domains of language learning, and student special needs related to language learning. And then finally, just a model from NACA. So this is the idea of culture and relevance and identity within NACA's mission. And part of that for us is land-based performance tasks. So we regularly take our teachers out, and you saw a photo of this just a moment ago, to do land-based learning so that they then can impart land-based learning on their 7th graders, 9th graders, 11th graders, et cetera. And so we ask them, why is it an essential part of NACA mission to provide regular land-based performance tasks to our students, where they're interacting with the land, where they are in the ideas of Pidgin, moving through the 4 R's: respect, responsibility, reciprocity, those kinds of things. So just a quick example there. I'll go back to my presentation, and I'm almost done. So just some references here. I pulled a number from our readings, as you can see, and then outside references related to culturally relevant learning, tribal crit, that kind of thing. So I guess just to wrap it up, back to my to this graphic that says that there are various leadership roles in education. Some are teacher level, some are administrator level, but all of them rest on this idea. I would think that there is a growing effort to enact inherent sovereignty in order to get the teachers in the classroom that represent the community and language, and to get professional learning that's developed around community outcomes, not just Western outcomes. So that's my presentation. Thanks for watching, and look forward to seeing yours.